Italy, it might not be so bad. But as the battlefield would shift again, and the war dragged into the winter of 1944, which was the coldest in Northern Europe in 40 years, the cool air constantly being pulled through your compartment created what crews described as a large armored refrigerator. By this point, commanders across the theater were openly preferring tanks over tank destroyers, and some were calling for the TD branch to be dissolved entirely. But the biggest test was yet to come. The invasion of France was being planned. Most of the tank destroyers prepared for D-Day were M10s with Hellcats just catching up. However, no one was really worried about what was about to happen once the Allies landed in Normandy, because the encounters with the new German Panther tank were rare and sporadic in Italy, and they didn't yet fully know that the guns on both the Hellcat and M10 were just not going to be enough to reliably take them out. To make this even worse, almost 40% of the German tanks in Normandy would be exactly Panthers. That is why the British were converting their M10s, and as many Shermans as they could, into Achilles and Fireflies, with the 17-pounder, which was at the time arguably the only Allied tank gun that could cause real trouble to heavy German armor. Nevertheless, as the beachheads were secured in the following days of the invasion, tank destroyers arrived in France and began their push inland. Here, they encountered yet another type of terrain that made the kind of fighting they were designed for impossible, and that was the bocage. Within days of moving off the beaches, American forces entered a patchwork of small agricultural fields, typically no more than 300 feet across, surrounded by dense hedgerows that might as well have been designed by the devil specifically to destroy everything the tank destroyer doctrine was built on. And the Germans used this as much as they could to prepare all sorts of ambushes for advancing Allied armor, from anti-tank guns and Panzerfausts to tanks and their own tank destroyers. Then came July 10th. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of the best-equipped German formations in Normandy, heavily stocked with Panthers, launches a counterattack near Le Désert, directly into positions held by the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion. At 2 in the morning, the Germans start their attack with tanks and infantry with the goal of splitting the Allied beachhead. Tank destroyers sprint into action for what is their original purpose. But they are about to find out that the 3-inch armor-piercing round bounces off the Panther's frontal glacis at 1,000 yards, and then at 500 yards, and at 200 as well. 80 millimeters of hardened steel sloped at 55 degrees turned out to be completely immune to tank destroyer fire. Tank destroyers frantically tried to flank the German tanks and hit them from the sides, but at such incredibly close range, this was not the easiest thing in the world to do. They managed to take out 12 Panthers, 1 Panzer IV, and 1 Stug in 2 days of literally point-blank fighting, but they suffered heavy losses as well. Sources I found couldn't say exactly how many, but it was more than enough to send a panic through the Allied command. HVAP tungsten core ammunition offered a solution on paper, but the rounds were desperately scarce. Most TD crews went through the entire war without seeing more than a handful of tungsten rounds. And here is the thing that makes it all even more frustrating. Because the army had decided that destroying enemy tanks was the job of a separate branch with separate weapons, there was no urgency to upgun the Sherman. The 75mm armed M4 was considered adequate for infantry support, and if it ran into a Panther, well, that was supposed to be the tank destroyer's problem. So the whole tank destroyer concept not only wasted resources, but it actively delayed the development of the tank they desperately needed. Now there is one more tank destroyer that had been in development ever since the M10's limitations were realized, but it was now sped up as much as possible after the Panther crisis hit. The M36 Jackson. It already existed on paper even weeks before D-Day, but the brass thought the guns they already had, although far from ideal, were still going to do the job. Well, the Panther showed that they were wrong. So they were now frantically trying to deploy Jacksons with the new 90mm gun. The idea was to take the proven M10A1 hull and chassis and design a new, larger turret that could house the bigger weapon. The 90mm M3 gun was derived from an anti-aircraft gun, and it was a massive leap over everything else the Americans had on a mobile platform. It could defeat the Panther's front at roughly 1,500 yards. So they were pushed into service as quickly as possible, but it still took time to prepare and ship them to Europe. Production was crash prioritized after Normandy exposed the gun crisis, and they were even putting the 90mm gun and turret on M4A3 Sherman hulls. It still had an open-top turret, which remained its biggest vulnerability, but the turret did have power traverse, which was a major improvement over the M10's hand-cranked nightmare. The gun was not without flaws, though. Early M36s lacked a muzzle brake, and the massive blast from the 90mm kicked up so much dust and debris that it blinded the gunner after every shot, slowing down the rate of fire significantly, but it worked incredibly against the German armor. There's even a confirmed kill on a Panther at 4,600 yards, basically the maximum range of its telescopic sight, and another one at 4,200 yards. 90mm high-explosive shells were also much more powerful. The M36 was well liked by its crews as one of the few Allied armored vehicles that could actually destroy heavy German tanks at a distance. That was what the crews had been dying for all along. As the Allies pushed the Germans back and were advancing through France, soon there was almost no tank-on-tank fighting, besides some isolated cases that got glamorized later in the movies, so people think that they happened much more often than they actually did. Tank destroyers were once again providing support for the infantry or working as mobile artillery and regular tanks. When they came to the German border, they met the Siegfried Line. This was a heavily fortified belt of pillboxes, tank obstacles like those so-called dragon's teeth, dotted with bunkers and trenches that were entangled and combined with the mountainous terrain into just a nightmare to clear and break through. But tank destroyers helped here quite a bit with their long-range accuracy for direct fire, blasting the fortifications one by one. And then one section of this Siegfried Line would bring fresh horrors for the tank destroyer crews, the Hürtgen Forest. The trees there grew so thick that even at midday, only a trickle of sunlight reached the forest floor. Roads were narrow, muddy logging trails where a single disabled vehicle could block an entire column. But the real problem was the trees, and not for the reason you might expect. The problem was once again the open-top turret. German artillery and mortar shells landed in the treetops and detonated on contact with the dense fir branches, creating what the troops called tree bursts. Instead of a single ground-level explosion, each round sent a shower of steel fragments and wooden splinters downward over a wide area, like a lethal rain falling from above. This took out a staggering number of tank destroyer crews in the open-top turrets, and the problem was nowhere more obvious than here. And while we are on the strong defensive lines, the Americans were actually trying to come up with a vehicle specifically for breaking these things, but they didn't quite manage to make one work. They had a similar idea to what the Germans did with their enormous tank destroyers like the Jagdpanther, or even worse, the Jagdtiger. On the American side, that was the T-28 project, a super heavy tank designed specifically to breach the Siegfried Line's concrete fortifications, with more than enough frontal armor to eat German anti-tank hits for breakfast and a 105mm high-velocity gun in a fixed casemate to poke holes in those bunkers. But the thing weighed over 90 tons, with 4 sets of tracks to spread all that weight, and was powered by a 500 horsepower engine that gave it the incredible top speed of 8 miles per hour. It was initially called the Gun Motor Carriage T-95, but was then redesignated as the Super Heavy Tank T-28. And technically, it was something we could put in the same basket, but built for a completely different reason. It never went into combat because the Siegfried Line had already been breached by infantry and conventional armor. On December 16, 1944, 3 German armies launched the Ardennes Offensive, with roughly 200,000 troops and over 600 tanks and assault guns. For the first and only time, the enemy launched exactly the kind of massed armored breakthrough that tank destroyer doctrine was designed to counter. 25 TD battalions would ultimately be committed to the battle, which was the largest concentration of American tank destroyer power in the war. Bastogne became one of the critical points where the entire battle could be won or lost. It was a road junction that 7 major roads ran through, and the Germans needed it to keep their advance moving. The 101st Airborne Division was rushed there to hold it, arriving on December 19th, and the town was encircled by December 21st. What the paratroopers desperately lacked was anti-tank capability. They were light infantry with nothing heavier than bazookas against an enemy bringing all sorts of armor in large numbers. But the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M18 Hellcats, would answer the call. Roughly 60 miles away, the Hellcats used their speed to race in and help the paratroopers at the most critical moment. On Christmas Day, 18 Panzers drove into a devastating crossfire. 4 Hellcats engaged from multiple angles, and all 18 tanks were destroyed. Throughout the entire siege of Bastogne, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed about 40 German tanks while losing only 6 Hellcats. What made Bastogne interesting from a doctrinal perspective is that this was, on the surface, exactly what tank destroyer doctrine had envisioned: a mobile TD force rushing to meet an enemy armored breakthrough. But it happened exactly once during the entire war, if we exclude Kasserine Pass, where they used those improvised gun motor carriages. The Bulge also proved to be the end of the towed tank destroyer battalions, which were overrun and decimated during the fighting. It was now obvious that they were simply too heavy, too slow, and too exposed for the new kind of combat. By the spring of 1945, tank destroyers were pretty much doing the job of regular tanks. German armor appeared in ones and twos, scattered and without fuel, more often dug in as static pillboxes. TD battalions spent their days clearing towns, blasting strongpoints, supporting infantry advances, and occasionally engaging a lone tank at close range in the rubble of German cities. A force of 100,000 men was built for a doctrine that would work exactly as intended only one time in the whole war. By war's end, commanders unanimously agreed that they would much prefer a real tank over a tank destroyer. The conclusion was that the tank destroyer, as a separate branch and a separate concept, was completely unnecessary, and it turned out that the best weapon to fight a tank was a better tank. Every tank destroyer battalion was deactivated over the following year after the war's end. What survived, however, was the gun. The Jackson's 90mm was the same gun mounted in the M26 Pershing, and the new concept became the main battle tank. The idea that one vehicle could do everything, from supporting infantry, exploiting breakthroughs, and killing other tanks. So, there was no need anymore for light, medium, heavy tanks and then tank destroyers, but the new vehicle would be all that in one.